What if the greatest hero of the 20th century wasn't a savior, but the architect of silence, starvation, and shadowed supremacy? History dares not whisper it. Schools skip it. Statues defy it. But behind the bulldog scowl and cigar smoke lies a storm of truths too volatile to touch. This is no case of moral ambiguity or flawed greatness. This is something colder, calculated, camouflaged. Winston Churchill. The name fires like cannon blast through Western memory. The man who stood tall while Europe burned. The lion who roared when empires trembled. But what if that roar drowned out 1,000 screams? What if the face etched on currency concealed the hand that signed off on famine? This isn't historical critique. This is exhumation. Tear away the myth, and you'll find blood under the laurels. 1943, Bengal is choking, shriveling into death. Millions perish as Churchill reroutes ships, hoards grain, and sneers at a beastly people breeding like rabbits. Not an oversight. Not war collateral. A verdict. Cold as steel. Sharp as colonial chains. And it doesn't end there. Kenya. Ireland. Iraq. Greece. A trail of scorched villages and broken bones, all swept beneath the marble pedestal of wartime glory. He wasn't merely defending empire, he was its executioner. Still think the victors write history? Then ask, who decides which bodies make it into the footnotes? In private letters, he wrote of the Aryan stock and spoke of eugenics as policy, not theory. He backed chemical warfare against uncivilized tribes. These are not rumors. These are records, classified, then ignored. Buried beneath medals and myth-making. What if Churchill's greatest weapon wasn't his voice, but the silence he wrapped around genocide? Historians launder his legacy like currency, erasing dissent with polished words and comfortable lies. But look close and the cracks are visible. Look closer, and they become canyons. Every act of defiance in the colonies wasn't just a rebellion, it was a response to a man who believed brown lives were expendable. That power should never kneel, only crush. There's a reason his darkest decisions were hidden behind smoke-filled war rooms and patriotic speeches. There's a reason you never saw his shadow in your textbook. Because to face the truth is to tear the crown from the corpse of empire and confront what was built beneath it. This is not about rewriting history. It's about dragging it, screaming and raw, into the light. The question is not whether Churchill had a dark side. The question is why we were never allowed to see it. The room was silent. Too silent. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that tightens your spine and presses on your chest like unseen hands. Somewhere in London, just beyond the gaslit windows and the velvet curtains, bombs were falling. Cities split open like fruit under steel jaws. People burned. Children screamed beneath the rubble of homes they dreamed in only hours before. And yet, in this room, Churchill's war room, there was only the quiet scratch of a pen. He sat there, half shadow, half icon. The cigar smoke curled like a living thing, wrapping around him like a serpent of war. His eyes didn't blink, they calculated. He wasn't watching the firestorm. He was shaping it. Let them burn, he muttered once, allegedly, about the Bengalis. But that came later. For now, he posed. The cameras adored him. The world leaned in, desperate for a symbol. He gave them one. Jowled face. Bowler hat. V for victory, fingers raised like a magician casting a spell. He spoke in thunder and honey, rhetoric wrapped in patriotism, soaked in bourbon. A titan standing alone against the Nazi abyss. But titans bleed too. And some bleed others. He knew exactly what they needed. Hope. Defiance. A face to follow into fire. So he gave them a mask. He wore it with precision. Crafted it with blood. Fed it with carefully selected words and images. The Lion of Britain, roaring while the cliffs of Dover trembled. But beneath that roar, something stirred. A colder truth, older than any war. The truth of power. The kind that doesn't defend, it consumes. There are photographs, framed in gold, where he looks like a grandfather. Stoic. Wise. But gold frames don't hold the screams of forgotten lands. They mute them. They don't show the young Kenyan boy watching his father dragged out of a hut, skull split open by British rifles. They don't show the Irish mother burying her second son, lost to a war Churchill helped ignite from a mahogany desk. They certainly don't show the Bengali mother whose breast ran dry, whose baby whimpered once before going limp like a fallen leaf. The myth was simple: Churchill stood alone when no one else would. But myths are stitched from omission. And behind every stitched thread lies something torn. What kind of man calls Gandhi a half-naked fakir while cities drown in ash and famine? What kind of man speaks of Aryan superiority as if quoting scripture? One not interested in saving lives, only carving his name into stone. But no one questioned him. Not loudly. Not when his words came wrapped in survival. England needed a god then, not a man. So they fed the myth and buried the man. He let them. Because this wasn't about nation. It was never about people. It was about legacy. About triumph by any means necessary. Morality was a cost of doing business. And business was booming. His speeches stirred souls, but his policies broke spines. Even his own allies feared him. Not for his enemies, but for how easily he could become one. Cold fury lived in that throat, a fury dressed in patriotism and punctuated by whiskey-soaked brilliance. He didn't just fight wars. He waged them like an artist, every death a brushstroke, every silence a masterstroke. And yet the lion roared on. Newspapers printed his words like scripture. Statues rose before the blood had dried. They crowned him a savior while the bodies still burned. He gave them what they wanted, a symbol. They never looked too close at what it cost. He wasn't just shaping history. He was blinding it. Steering it. Taming it with quotes and charisma while reality writhed beneath. There's something monstrous in a man who smiles for cameras while knowing full well what he's condemned to starve. But no monster ever called himself one. He believed in destiny. In empire. In hierarchy carved by skin and birth. He wasn't whispering into the abyss, he was speaking from it. Even now, the mask holds. Textbooks shield it. Statues defend it. Politicians quote him, worship him, resurrect him when patriotism feels fragile. But masks, no matter how thick, decay. And beneath this one, beneath the bow tie, the bulldog jaw, the baritone voice, there's something else. Something watching. Something waiting to be seen. The silence that began in that war room still lingers. Not the kind that follows peace. The kind before revelation. The kind before reckoning. The ground was still wet with blood when the sun rose over Omdurman. It glistened like spilled ink across the desert, thick and silent, soaking into sand that could no longer tell the difference between water and death. British rifles still smoked in the arms of soldiers too dazed to feel their own triumph. And somewhere among the dead, 11,000 Sudanese bodies torn by bullets and bayonets, a young Winston Churchill sat atop a horse, eyes cold, proud, untouched. He called it glory. He called it necessary. But the truth? It was slaughter. Modern weapons against spears. A one-sided massacre he later bragged about, recounting how he shot at retreating men for sport. He described it like a fox hunt. No remorse. Just the thrill of blood and the thrill of empire. This was not war. This was a ritual. The empire didn't conquer with flags. It conquered with fire. And Churchill, he lit the match with a grin. He spoke of civilization as though it had a skin tone. He measured worth by accent, loyalty, whiteness. To him, the sun never set on the British Empire because it never rose for those beneath it. India. Kenya. Sudan. The empire carved their backs open like offerings, sacrifices for the God King of Westminster. And Churchill? He was the priest and the blade. He didn't just inherit this empire. He believed in it, worshipped it, fed it with steel and starvation. When Indians cried for freedom, he sneered. When they died by the millions, he shrugged. He once called Indians a beastly people with a beastly religion. That sentence wasn't a slip, it was policy. And when Bengal begged for grain, he withheld it, diverted it, watched as bodies piled in the streets like fallen leaves, limp, gray, forgotten. 3 million people gone. Mothers chewing bark to survive. Fathers walking miles for food that no longer existed. Children blinking through ribs as thin as bird bones. He blamed them. Said it was their fault for breeding like rabbits. Not even silence followed that line, just paperwork. Cold, clinical death signed in ink from an office in London. He didn't fire a bullet that day. He didn't have to. He had power, and power doesn't bleed. It commands. It starves. Kenya rose. And Churchill sent soldiers. When the Mau Mau rebelled against chains too tight to breathe through, he called them savages. Tortured them. Castrated men. Raped women with bottles and bayonets. Camps, whips, silence. And when it was over, when the empire finally loosened its grip just enough to pretend it had never clenched, the records were burned. Thousands of pages, gone in smoke. As if history itself had been put on trial and executed. Because truth was always the greatest threat to empire. He understood that. Churchill was not careless. He was precise. He knew how to write history and how to erase it. He crafted a world where brutality wore a crown, where conquest became civilization, and where entire continents could scream and be labeled troublemakers. He called white civilization superior. Not in whispers, but in policy. Not in theory, but in practice. He believed some were born to rule and others to kneel. That empire was not theft, it was destiny. That brown and black lives were currency to be spent for the glory of the throne. And he spent them. Liberally. His speeches roused the British soul, but for millions under colonial rule, his name was a curse, a shadow cast over generations. They didn't see a lion. They saw a butcher. But even gods crave worship. And Churchill's myth was built not just with power, but with story. Carefully trimmed, edited, sanctified. The God King who held the world back from darkness while feeding it to another. He wrote books. Won prizes. Sat beneath portraits of himself. But those portraits don't show the empires burning behind him. They don't show the boy in India coughing blood because medicine was reserved for whites. They don't show the Kenyan woman whose womb was torn by state-sanctioned rage. They don't show the Sudanese fighter, pierced by bullets, still gripping a spear because he believed he could protect his land. They don't show truth. Because truth is messy. Truth doesn't win medals. Truth bleeds. But it never forgets. The winds that sweep through Delhi, Nairobi, Khartoum, they still carry names. They still whisper things the statues never will. Because empires fall, but the blood they spill seeps into the soil, into the bones of the earth, into the dreams of those who remember. And in that silence, Churchill remains. Not as a hero. Not as a savior. But as something else entirely. The baby was still breathing when the flies began to feed. Barely. Her lips were cracked, her eyes too large for her skull, as if hunger had hollowed her soul before it reached her flesh. Her mother, what was left of her, held her against a chest that no longer produced milk, only the illusion of comfort. Around them, the village sat in a state of stillness so complete, it was louder than war. No bullets. No bombs. Just bones and silence. That silence had a name. Calcutta. 1943, famine spread like rot beneath the skin of the British Empire. It wasn't famine by drought, nor by flood. It wasn't nature. It was choice. A silence so cold, so precise, it could only be called calculated. It came wearing uniforms. It came in crates of grain diverted away. It came with memos and signatures and the deadly weight of policy. Winston Churchill, bulldog of Britain, god of defiance, architect of indifference, sat thousands of miles away, sipping whiskey and dictating war plans while an entire province begged for the right to live. He knew. His advisors told him. Repeatedly. Grain stocks existed. Ships could sail. Relief was possible. But nothing came. Instead, he asked, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" That was the sentence. Spoken not as a joke, not in a whisper, but as a sneer. As if mocking a starving people was a national sport. As if 3 million lives were worth less than a headline. The famine was not an accident. It was starvation weaponized. He needed them. He summoned them. He prayed to them. And when peace came, real, final, trembling peace, he looked around like a man stripped of his skin. The silence was deafening. The applause faded. The empire cracked. And the prophet stood alone, gripping matches with no more wood to burn. But still, his name was sung. Statues rose. Books praised. And few dared ask, what kind of man loves war so much that he dragged the world through fire, just to feel alive? The ashes know. The air in the room was thick, choking. The laughter at the dinner table had long since stopped, the words settling into the silence like stones in a grave. The guests at Churchill's estate were drinking, toasting, but the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. The man at the center of it all, his fat fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey, stared into the fire, his eyes burning with a conviction that had nothing to do with history or reason. "You see, my friends," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, like a snake coiling around its prey, "the British Empire is, in essence, a divine experiment." The words lingered in the air like poison, filling the room with the unmistakable scent of something decayed. The fire crackled, casting distorted shadows on the walls. "Some races are simply born to rule," he continued. "And others, well, they are destined to serve." It wasn't the first time he had spoken these words, and it wouldn't be the last. Churchill's obsession with race, his beliefs in the inherent superiority of the Anglo-Saxon, had become a whispered refrain among his inner circle. It was the anthem of an empire at its peak, and it was drenched in a darkness that few cared to acknowledge. His views were no accident. They were calculated, deliberate, passed down like a family heirloom. To him, the British were more than a people, they were chosen. They were the pinnacle of civilization, the crown of mankind, destined by God to rule, to subjugate, to control. And in his twisted mind, every other race was inferior, lesser. In his view, the Irish, the Jews, the Africans, the Indians, they were nothing more than stepping stones in the grand design, they to be ruled over, their worth measured by the utility they provided to the empire. He didn't hide it. He flaunted it. In public, he spoke of democracy, freedom, and the glories of the British Empire, painting his words with the varnish of civilization. But in private, in the comfort of his estate or the backrooms of power, the truth came through in brutal, unvarnished clarity. His mind, depraved and obsessed with the idea of racial hierarchy, was a breeding ground for the most grotesque forms of social Darwinism. He spoke of the Jews as a race of people born for the subjugation of others, of the Indians as the subject race to be kept in line, and of the Africans as uncivilized and inferior. These weren't the views of a man who had merely accepted the status quo. These were the thoughts of a man who believed the world had a natural order, a divine hierarchy, and that he, as the ruler of the British Empire, was ordained to enforce it. To him, the subjugation of entire peoples wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. The rise of the British was a manifestation of a higher will. And anyone who stood in the way of that vision, anyone who dared to challenge it, was destined to be crushed. And crushed him he did. In the harsh, oppressive policies he enacted in India, in the brutal response to Irish rebellion, in his chilling disregard for the lives of those in the colonies, Churchill didn't just tolerate oppression. He celebrated it. He believed in the purity of the British race, and to him, every death in the name of empire was justified, a small sacrifice to maintain the divine order. But it wasn't just the people of the empire who suffered under his beliefs. It was the very fabric of humanity itself. Because in Churchill's eyes, there were no equal peoples. No brothers and sisters in the eyes of God. There were only those who deserved to rule and those who deserved to serve. The Irish were not to be considered equals, but obstacles to be removed. The Irish famine, a mass death sentence for millions, was a small price to pay in the grand game of imperialism. The Indians, though desperate for independence, were treated as mere children who didn't know what was best for them, so Churchill punished them with the same indifference he showed to anyone beneath his perceived station. But it wasn't just politics. It was personal. His hatred wasn't born from any grand, logical cause, it was bred in his very soul. He looked upon the world as a stage, with races as mere players, all vying for their place. And the British, his beloved British, were to take the lead. Anyone else was to bow down. Anyone else was to be crushed under the wheels of progress. And the myth, the twisted myth, grew. Like the ancient, corrupted idea of a chosen race, Churchill wove this narrative into his very being. He made the British Empire his altar, the lives of millions his sacrifices. He whispered to himself that he was a prophet, sent to deliver this truth to the world. He painted himself as a savior, when in reality, he was the bringer of ruin, of despair, of suffering. Yet even today, the myth endures. The myth that Churchill was a hero, that his empire was built on noble foundations, that he was a man of honor. But the truth lies in the shadows, hidden from the light, the truth that Churchill's vision of greatness was built on a foundation of blood, hatred, and racial supremacy. A twisted, perverse belief that some lives were worth more than others, and that those who were not chosen were merely pawns in a game of conquest. Churchill's legacy, drenched in myth, is one of violence, of destruction, and of a belief so deep, so rooted in the bones of imperialism, that it can never truly be undone. The darkness in his soul lives on in the pages of history, a reminder of the price that was paid to keep the empire intact, and the price still being paid by those who were never meant to have a voice. A single gunshot echoed through the Irish night, splitting the air with the weight of 1,000 forgotten dreams. It was the sound of defiance, of a hope unbowed, rising against the iron fist of an empire that had taken everything, lives, lands, freedom, and left nothing but smoldering ashes. A moment of rebellion, fleeting yet eternal, as a bullet met flesh in the dark, unforgiving streets of Dublin. And then, the silence. That chilling silence that follows the crush of power. The silence of a crushed people, their cries unheard, their blood spilled for the sake of a brutal and unrelenting vision. Winston Churchill stood over it all, a figure draped in the mantle of power, the empire's dark prophet. To him, Ireland was not a land of rebels, of freedom fighters, of families torn apart by the weight of colonial rule. Ireland was a problem to be eliminated, to be crushed beneath the heel of the British Empire's insatiable might. And so, Churchill watched as the flames of rebellion were snuffed out with merciless precision. The Irish War of Independence had waged on, a desperate struggle to cast off the chains of imperial rule. But Churchill, the man who prided himself on his indomitable will, on his unwavering leadership, had a different vision. To him, Ireland was a threat. A threat to the sanctity of the British Empire. A threat to his dream of dominance, of control. The flame of Irish freedom would be extinguished, no matter the cost. And so, the Black and Tans were unleashed. They were the embodiment of Churchill's will, his most brutal weapon in his crusade against Irish resistance. The Black and Tans, men of violence, of hate, were dispatched to do what Churchill had longed for, quell the rebellion, silence the cries for freedom, and ensure that Ireland would remain under the Empire's iron thumb. They did not ask questions. They did not listen to pleas. They were the embodiment of chaos, of retribution, of an empire willing to drown an entire people in their own blood just to maintain control. The streets of Ireland became a battleground, a place where the will of an empire was imposed with gunfire, with terror, with brutality. Entire villages were burned to the ground, families torn apart, the air thick with the screams of the innocent. Churchill's response? Silence. Cold indifference. His commitment to preserving the empire came before all else, before morality, before justice, before the lives of the men, women, and children whose only crime was daring to fight for their freedom. But what's a tyrant to do when his own people rise against him? What's a king to do when his own brothers, his own blood, demand to be free? Churchill knew the answer. He had always known. The myth of the tyrant, one who sacrifices his own, who slays his own brothers, all in the name of preserving a kingdom, had lived long before him, and it would live long after. So, the blood spilled, and the war raged on. The Irish were forced to bend, to kneel before the crown, or to die. The rebellion was crushed, and the myth of British superiority grew. The tyrant had succeeded, at least for a moment. But there was a price to pay. There is always a price when the blood of the innocent is spilled so recklessly. Ireland would never forget. And neither would Churchill. The weight of his choices would haunt him, gnaw at him from the inside. There would be no solace for a man who had slaughtered his own brothers in the name of a kingdom that could never last. There would be no peace for the man who had sacrificed the lives of countless innocents, who had burned the dreams of a nation. The kingdom he had fought so desperately to preserve would crumble, just as all empires do. And in the end, what would be left of him? A man who had used his people as pawns, who had drenched his hands in their blood, all for the sake of power. Nothing. No glory. No heroism. Just the cold, unforgiving truth. A tyrant who slays his brothers to save the kingdom, such was the fate of Winston Churchill. The thick, suffocating darkness of the war room is pierced only by the dim flicker of a solitary light bulb overhead, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. A huddled group of men, their faces stern and eyes locked with a cold, calculated resolve, gather around the table. The air is thick with the stench of secrecy, betrayal hanging like an invisible shroud over the proceedings. This is where power is born, where fates are sealed with a whispered word, and where the blood of nations is spilled, not by the hands of a single tyrant, but by a cabal, a network, a shadow cabinet of enablers, each one complicit in the horrors unfolding. In this room, Winston Churchill is not alone. The men around him, those shadow kings, serve not as mere bystanders but as active participants in the theater of destruction, their loyalty to the empire more important than the lives destroyed in its name. Every nod, every glance exchanged between them is a silent pact, a vow of complicity in the crimes they know too well but choose to ignore. The weight of their silence presses in like a suffocating fog. These are not the heroes of history. These are the architects of suffering, the men who enabled Churchill's darkest decisions. Men who, from the safety of their high offices, sanctioned the slaughter of millions, and then, just as quickly, erased the blood from their hands. But history, twisted and contorted, would remember them not as they were, but as they wished to be remembered, glorified, mythologized, their sins buried beneath the weight of carefully crafted propaganda. There's the press, too, lurking in the shadows, complicit in this great masquerade. They paint Churchill as a lion, a fearless leader, a hero born of steel and fire. But the truth, the one hidden deep behind the glorifying words and the polished images, is far darker. The press didn't just tell the world what they wanted to hear, they told them what they were told to hear. They stood beside Churchill's shadow cabinet, masked in their own lies, protecting the myth of a king who could do no wrong. The British people, hungry for a hero, devoured the fiction that was fed to them, never questioning the blood-stained hands behind the legend. The glorification of Churchill didn't come from the strength of his character, it came from the court that surrounded him, the shadowy figures who made sure that the truth was buried, that the light of scrutiny never shone too brightly on the depths of his depravity. They were the ones who constructed the narrative, who shaped public opinion with a deft hand and a cold heart. They were the ones who gave the world a man of legend, while the real man, the one who made impossible choices, who waged war not for justice, but for his own unyielding hunger for power, was carefully hidden from view. And the myth persisted. Churchill's legacy became a carefully curated collection of speeches, of moments of supposed brilliance, of a nation standing proud and defiant against the world. The British Empire, dripping with the blood of its colonies, was washed clean in the glow of the heroic leader. The shadow cabinet, with their whispered promises and veiled threats, ensured that any dissent would be buried, drowned in a flood of national pride and historical whitewashing. Their complicity is the ghost that haunts every triumph, every victory. They knew. They saw the darkness that lurked beneath Churchill's triumphs. They saw the blood that was spilled, the lives destroyed in the name of empire. But they chose silence. They chose loyalty to a man, to a cause, to an empire that could never be allowed to crumble. Their loyalty wasn't to truth, but to power. They protected the Dark Father. They upheld the myth of the great leader. They wore the mask, each of them complicit in the construction of a history that would absolve them all. Their silence was the loudest of all. But the truth that lurks beneath their polished facades, cannot be buried forever. The lives lost, the screams silenced, the blood spilled on the altar of empire, these things cannot be forgotten. Not by the world, and not by those who remember. And so, the myth endures, but so does the darkness. In the shadows of history, they still stand. The men who protected Churchill's darkest secrets, who sold the soul of a nation for power, who traded the lives of millions for the empire's survival. They are the true inheritors of Churchill's legacy, the shadow cabinet of enablers who shaped history with their silence, who protected a tyrant's bloodstained throne, and who watched as the world bowed to the myth they had created. But time is unforgiving. History has a way of peeling back the layers of lies, of exposing the ugly truth hidden beneath the surface. And so, the myths will crumble, the shadows will recede, and the faces of those who protected the Dark Father will be revealed for who they truly were. Enablers. Complicit. Silent. The night air is thick with smoke, the sky streaked with the burning embers of what once was. Beneath the hellish glow of flames, the city of Dresden is nothing more than a scorched wound in the earth. Buildings that had stood for centuries, filled with history and life, now lay in ruins, reduced to rubble. The screams of the dying, the cries of the innocent, are swallowed by the relentless roar of bombs that tore through the heart of civilization. There, amidst the chaos, stands a figure, strong, resolute, a man with the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Winston Churchill, the hero, the Lion of Britain, they called him. But what is a hero in the face of this? What is a hero when his decisions lead to this unholy destruction? The question hangs in the smoke-choked air, unanswered, as the myths of the war hero begin to crack and splinter. This is the moment when the truth is almost too much to bear. For all the speeches, all the accolades, all the adoration, there is the reality, the cold, hard reality of choices made in the name of power, in the name of victory, in the name of an empire built on blood and broken promises. Churchill, the man who would become the symbol of British defiance, was not above the darkness of war. His decisions, though wrapped in the grandeur of necessity, were often a brutal calculus, a ruthless game of power where the lives of men, women, and children were pawns on a board. The bombing of Dresden was not an isolated event, nor was it the only stain on his soul. In Greece, when the civil war raged and the lives of countless innocents hung in the balance, Churchill's hand, strong and decisive, saw the blood of those crushed beneath the wheels of his political agenda. The violence, the suffering, it all served a single purpose, the preservation of his empire. But what of the cost? What of the sacrifices made to fuel this unyielding drive for power? What of the lives, destroyed not for the greater good, but for political gain, for dominance in a world at war? Every death, every ruined city, was not a victory, it was a choice, made by a man who thought of himself as a hero, but whose decisions were stained by the blood of the fallen. The myth of Churchill, the war hero, was woven in the fires of battle, but those flames consumed everything in their path, including the very soul of the man who stood at their heart. He was no god, no noble leader who sacrificed for the good of all. He was a man, a flawed man, driven by ambition and ego. His compromises with Stalin and Roosevelt, made in the dimly lit corridors of power, were not about securing peace, but about shaping the post-war world in his image. Every handshake, every promise made, was a pawn moved on a chessboard that stretched across continents. And the sacrifices? The deaths? They were collateral damage in a war for supremacy, not salvation. Churchill's eyes, burning with the fierce fire of ambition, never saw the toll of his decisions. The victims, the families torn apart, the children who would never grow old, these were nothing but numbers, nothing but sacrifices to the gods of war and power. The myth told of a man who led Britain through the darkest days of World War II, who stood defiant against the might of Nazi Germany, but it failed to mention the price at which this defiance came. The truth is unbearable, yet it is the truth we must confront. The war hero who stood tall amidst the rubble, the lion whose roar echoed across the world, was also the architect of some of the most horrific decisions of the war. The bombing campaigns that tore through cities, the political maneuvers that fueled further violence, the unwillingness to negotiate peace on terms that could have spared so many. These were the decisions of a man who was no hero, but a man drunk on power, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to preserve his vision of the world. And yet, despite the blood and destruction, the myth persists. Churchill is remembered as the war hero, the man who triumphed over tyranny, the man who stood firm in the face of darkness. The legend is protected, upheld by those who choose to forget or ignore the cost of his decisions. The war hero, immortalized in statues, in films, in the collective memory of a nation, is a construct, a carefully curated image, crafted by those who benefited from the war, from the empire, from the myth. The truth, the real cost of those decisions, is buried beneath layers of history, hidden in the shadows of the narrative that has been passed down through generations. But the myth cannot last forever. The cracks are beginning to show, the walls of this fabricated heroism beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. Churchill, the man who sought to carve his name into the annals of history, may have been the architect of a war for power, but he was also the man who allowed the suffering of millions to be swept aside in the name of empire, in the name of his own ambition. His legacy, once seen as untouchable, now stands on shaky ground, vulnerable to the relentless passage of time, to the scrutiny of those who dare to look beyond the myth. And so, the question remains, what is a hero, really? Is it the man who stands tall in the face of evil, no matter the cost? Or is it the man who chooses the path of least destruction, the one who recognizes the humanity in others and refuses to sacrifice it for the sake of his own glory? Churchill may have been a hero to some, but in the end, he was also a man who knew the price of war, and yet chose to pay it anyway, knowing full well the blood that would stain his hands. The myth of the war hero is shattered, and with it, the man who built it. The thunderous applause in the grand hall rings like a verdict, sealing the fate of a man long after his final breath. The weight of history, the weight of a nation's collective memory, has been cast upon him. There, under the glow of the stage lights, stands Winston Churchill, his chest swelled with the accolade of a lifetime, the Nobel Prize. The world applauds. The world fawns. And as the echo of those clapping hands fades into silence, one truth remains undeniable: the applause is not for the man, but for the myth he has become. Churchill is gone now. His body lies cold, his name immortalized, but it is not the body of the man that they mourn, it is the story of the man. The sanitized, perfected legacy crafted in the image of heroism. The air has been cleared, the stains removed, the blood that marks his hands forgotten, buried beneath layers of historical revisionism. With every retelling of his story, the cracks are filled, the ugly truths smoothed over, until what remains is a polished, shining god of history. A man transformed into something untouchable, infallible, divine. But who is this God? What truth remains of the flawed mortal beneath the layers of myth? The world, in its reverence, has lost sight of the man who once stood in the ruins of Dresden, his decisions leading to the death of thousands, perhaps millions. The hero, the war leader, the lion-hearted prime minister has become a figure of worship, as sacred and untouchable as the past itself. The blood on his hands has dried, the stench of destruction forgotten in the warm embrace of victory and fame. The media plays its part, as it always does, in the creation of a legend. The biographies pour forth like rivers of ink, each one carving a deeper groove in the bedrock of myth. Writers, historians, and politicians alike rush to immortalize him, to secure his place in history as the man who saved Britain, the man who defied the Nazis, the man who stood at the crossroads of a dark and uncertain world. The truth, raw and painful, has been buried beneath layers of words, carefully constructed to protect the myth. Churchill's personal flaws, his failures, his cruelty, have been erased from the pages of history, or at the very least, softened, justified, or forgotten. The past is rewritten, and with it, the man is remade. The years following the war are a blur of speeches and accolades, a dance of political maneuvering and myth-building. Churchill's legacy is not allowed to die with him. It is immortalized, shaped, and reinforced. His actions, however controversial, are portrayed as necessary, his decisions as brilliant. The wars he fought, both on the battlefield and within the political arena, are redefined as heroic, as if the very idea of war itself could be glorified. But behind the statues, behind the parades, there is a disquieting silence. The voices of those who suffered, the voices of those who were crushed under the weight of his choices, are drowned out by the relentless noise of adoration. The true cost of his victories is lost in the haze of myth. It is in this myth-making, this careful crafting of a flawless legacy, that the true tragedy lies. For Churchill was not a god, nor was he a hero in the traditional sense. He was a man who, at times, made the right choice, but more often than not, made the decisions that served only his own ambition, his own desire for power. The price of that power was borne by the lives of the many, the lives of the innocents who paid the cost for the preservation of empire, for the preservation of a vision that, in hindsight, seems more rooted in greed than in the defense of freedom. And yet, despite it all, the myth endures. The legends are passed down through generations, carefully shaped by those who benefit from its perpetuation. The media, the politicians, the historians, they all have a hand in the process, ensuring that the god of history remains untouchable, untainted by the blood that stained his reign. Every anniversary, every celebration, every remembrance, reaffirms his place as a larger-than-life figure. The world is complicit in this myth-making. The state's narrative, woven through every speech, every memorial, every statue, reinforces the idea that Churchill was a savior. A man of destiny. A man who stood firm in the face of adversity, no matter the cost. And in doing so, they protect the myth. They shield it from the harsh glare of truth, ensuring that the god of history remains just that, a god, untouched, unchallenged, revered. But the price of myth-making is silence. In the clamor of reverence, the voices of the fallen are drowned out. The voices of those who suffered under the policies, under the decisions made by the man now called a god, are silenced. The children who starved in Bengal, the civilians who died in Dresden, the countless others whose lives were ruined, who speaks for them? The god of history has no room for their pain, their suffering, their memories. As the years pass, the legend only grows stronger, more unassailable. The man who was once a flawed mortal is now a towering figure, beyond reproach, beyond understanding. His image, carved in marble and etched in the minds of millions, is the only face that remains. The rest, the darkness, the shadows, the inconvenient truths, are buried, erased, forgotten. And so, the myth of Churchill lives on, a god of history, unbroken and untouchable. But with each passing year, as the world moves further from the days of war, the silence grows louder, and the questions become harder to ignore. Was he a god, or was he simply a man, like any other, shaped by ambition, greed, and the ravages of history? The myth will survive, but the truth? The truth is waiting in the shadows, just beyond the light of history's stage. A lone figure stands in the dim light of an empty street, gazing up at the weathered statue that towers over the square. The stone face, carved with such reverence, seems to watch him with eyes that gleam with power and pride, frozen in time. The world around him stirs, people walk by, unaware, indifferent, as though this monument is just another piece of the cityscape, another story passed down in hushed tones. But for him, the statue is a symbol of a reckoning, a haunting reminder that truth has been buried beneath layers of myth and legend for far too long. The shadows whisper, and the weight of history presses down on his chest, suffocating him with the knowledge that the stories we tell ourselves, the heroes we elevate, are often constructed from the darkest corners of our collective guilt. The air is thick with silence, thick with the tension of generations who have turned their eyes away from the uncomfortable truths. And now, as the world shakes with the weight of injustice, the truth claws its way out of the darkness. It is ugly. It is raw. It is uncomfortable. The time for heroes is over, and the time for reckoning has arrived. The myths that have been spun around figures like Winston Churchill are beginning to crack. What were once untouchable legends are now revealing their fractures. The heroic tales of triumph over evil, of victory against tyranny, now sit like broken statues in a world that can no longer turn away from the rubble beneath them. The truth has always been there, just beneath the surface, buried in the blood-stained ground, waiting to be uncovered. But it was easier to look away, to bask in the warmth of those myths. Easier to believe in the legend than to face the blood-soaked reality. History is no longer a simple narrative of good versus evil. It is no longer a neatly packaged story that leaves us with the warm, comforting illusion that everything is as it should be. The oppressed, the forgotten, the silenced, their voices are rising now, louder than ever, as they demand to be heard, as they force us to confront the myths we've been told, the myths we've allowed to define our world. For too long, we have been complicit in the construction of these heroes, and the glorification of men who wielded power without care for the bodies they trampled beneath their feet. But as the statue cracks and the myth shatters, the truth stands naked before us, and we must reckon with it, face it, embrace it. The debates rage now, across cities, across nations. Should these monuments, these symbols of power, continue to stand tall? Should we continue to glorify the men who shaped history with the blood of others? The voices of those who have long been silenced are no longer muffled. They demand recognition, they demand justice, they demand the world to see what has been obscured for far too long. The question is no longer whether we should dismantle the statues, but whether we should dismantle the myths themselves, the myths that have protected the legacies of men like Churchill, who, in their pursuit of power, left destruction in their wake. But even as the monuments are torn down, even as the statues fall, the myth persists. It has seeped into the very fabric of our collective consciousness, woven into every story, every history, every lesson passed down from one generation to the next. We were taught to revere the men who stood at the top, who wielded power, who made the decisions that shaped the world. But what if the stories we were told were wrong? What if the heroes we elevated were nothing more than men who lived in the shadows of their own flaws, their own cruelties, their own ambition? Churchill, for all his grand speeches and his wartime rhetoric, was not a god. He was a man whose actions were shaped by the same greed, the same power-hungry thirst that has consumed so many before him. The legacy we built for him, the pedestal we placed him on, was not a reflection of his greatness, but of our own need to justify the destruction, the violence, the oppression he inflicted. We need heroes, we need saviors to believe in, so we build them from the flawed men who changed the course of history. But at what cost? The truth is painful. It is agonizing. It stings with the sharpness of betrayal, with the weight of centuries of injustice. It is easier to believe in the myth, easier to revere the image of the man we created, than to accept the brutal reality of his actions. But the reckoning is here. It is unavoidable. The voices of the oppressed are too loud to silence any longer. The myth can no longer shield us from the truth. As we look back on the legacy of men like Churchill, we must ask ourselves, what do we really see? Do we see the hero, the savior of the free world? Or do we see the man who carved his name into history with the blood of those he deemed expendable, who turned his back on the suffering of millions for the sake of empire, for the sake of his own glory? The truth cannot be buried forever. The reckoning is coming, and it will not be kind. The statues may fall, the names may be forgotten, but the truth will endure. It will echo through the corridors of history, reverberating in the hearts and minds of those who dare to confront it. The time for myths is over. The time for truth is now. The reckoning has begun. And in that reckoning, there is no place for silence. There is no room for complicity. Only the brutal, unflinching gaze of history, staring us in the face, demanding that we face the truth. Not the truth of legend, but the truth of reality. The myth of Churchill, like the myth of every hero who has stood before us, is crumbling. And in its place, we must build something new, something honest, something real, something worthy of the world we wish to create. The truth is here. The reckoning has begun.